Welcome to episode 2 of Podcana. This is a podcast that dives into the headlines, the news, and the strategies around Disney's Lorcana TCG. I'm Flake alongside Brendan Patrick, and we bring you the headlines to discuss this week, Brendan.
Yeah, so episode 2 is going to be digging into the anatomy of a Lorcana card. We're going to be talking about what all those numbers represent, what keywords we know about, and what we can decipher from all the information. What is that insidious pip symbol, or lore as we better know it now. But first, we're going to kick it off with this week's Elsa Icebreaker. All right, Flake, you asked me the question last week, so I get it this week. And what is your favorite Disney soundtrack?
A whole soundtrack is kind of like a big chunk to chew on because, you know, when it comes to Disney songs, like each movie has like its own unique banger every single time. And finding a movie that has like every single song is like, this is the soundtrack. I know people out there are going to be like if I hear Let It Be one more time, I might go crazy because I think for the longest time that was like the song of, I don't know how long ago it was, like 8 years now or so. That was just the thing. But I've got a soft spot for Disney's Hercules. I think that is like one of the most under the radar, underappreciated Disney movies ever. And they had some really good songs in Disney's Hercules.
They did, and I do agree that movie is very underrated. Actually, one of my favorite Lorcana cards right now has a character from that movie. Mine is, it's not going to be a soundtrack, but it is a song, so it's the bare necessities, calling back to my Jungle Book roots there. I also think that Mulan's I'm Gonna Make a Man Out of You is pretty fantastic. It was actually, back when I wrestled in high school, we got to have these walkout songs, and my walkout song was I'm Gonna Make a Man Out of You. So it's got a soft spot in my heart. That question was from JHugs on Twitter. So if you want to get your question submitted to the Elsa Icebreaker, go ahead and shoot us a comment in the YouTube below, or tweet at us on Twitter, whatever you want. What are the so Flake, let's head into the headlines. We got some crazy new information this week. What do you have for us?
All right, so I got to speak to Artem at Lorcania.com, a really great website and resource for you guys to go check out. Artem was at the Nuremberg Toy Fair and got some sweet information, got to actually hold the product in his hand, Brendan, which is really cool. We were talking about it privately. I had a call with him a couple days ago, and we were just chatting about everything. He spoke to people like Ryan Miller, who is the lead designer on Lorcana, and part of it was he showed me a bunch of stuff, but he also said there's only a little bit of this that you're allowed to talk about. So what we're going to talk about here is the gift set and what those counters are in the back. So there's like a picture that is available for you guys. This is a little better resolution of what comes in the actual gift set. And those counters, remember last week we were talking about what do those counters represent? This solves a few of those mysteries because those counters are damage counters, Brendan.
Yeah, which is to be, and I talked about what I hope they what I hope they weren't, and that's what they turned out to be. I think that, so we see damage counters showing up in the gift set. We see 32 of them. That's quite a lot, but I think that we can discern from 32 being in the gift set, if we look at the number of tokens and the things like the starter decks and pretty much all the other product options, that it's not like, it doesn't translate 1-to-1 in terms of the ratio. So it looks like there's much more of these counters in the gift set than there is in other products, which makes me think that they're actually supplemental and not core to playing the game. And if counters are not core to playing the game, it makes me think that damage is not persistent throughout the entire game. Because if damage did exist for the entire game, you would absolutely need counters. There's no way you can remember that stuff. But if you look at a game like Magic the Gathering, damage is persistent, but it's persistent through the turn. And I think that counters existing in this sort of quantity in a single product points more towards damage just existing in a turn or a turn cycle, because it's in Magic, you could nobody represents counters for your thing is taking 3 damage. We just kind of remember it, but the gift set could supplement that by giving you these extra counters. If the game is made more for kids, just make things easier. So I genuinely hope that's the way we're going, in the form of, damage is persistent through the turn or the turn cycle. So both players' turns in one single turn cycle, but not the entire game, because there's nothing more I dislike more. And if you've played board games, you felt like board games can execute this correctly. But if you've played a card game that tried to take that board game aspect of having a bunch of dice, having a bunch of counters, like it usually, I mean, it universally feels extremely clunky. I don't think it's been executed correctly yet.
That's the part, is like it's clunky, right? Like there's a lot of things to keep track of, and there's no worse feeling sometimes is like when I'm going to like, let's say, a Flesh and Blood tournament or something else. What annoys me most is when I can't just show up with a deck box of 60 or 80 cards or whatever it is. I have to show up with a deck box, and it has to have a tray of like 900 different dice and counters and things to keep track of that. And I understand that a lot of this can kind of be done mentally to a degree, but you need some sort of representation, because when your opponent's on the other side of the board, they want to make sure that at a glance they understand what the board state is, and that's what these counters are for. And I think that damage being persistent that leans more towards like what the Hearthstone style is, where you knock into something, it's going to maintain the damage unless it's healed, it's dealt with. We don't know what a lot of the cards are. We don't know. We don't have any clues yet whether the damage is, like, to really solve this mystery. Because what if there's a character that comes out, Brendan, that says something along the lines of remove 2 damage counters from an opponent? Like, when you play this card, remove 2 damage counters from one of your characters.
So that could still be, turn-based persistent damage. Like you spoke about Hearthstone, right? Hearthstone's a great example of, game length persistent damage. And I think that, Hearthstone's a good example of that because it can only be executed in a digital game. So like there's another game that came out recently called Soulforge Fusion. It's a reboot of a digital game, and the physical version does have persistent damage throughout the entire game. And holy cow, Flake, it is. You can only be playing, like, you have 5 lanes, so you're actually limited on how much you can play out on a single board, but it is still so cumbersome if you find like a deck that is either, increasing life totals of all your characters, or you're doing 1 damage to everything. Like, it is a major pain in the butt. So yeah, Hearthstone's an example of it being used correctly because they're leveraging the digital format. So really hoping that, for this physical TCG that is not going to be the case. And I still got to call back that the fact that there's 32 of them, 32 damage counters specifically in the gift set, makes me feel like they're just a very, very supplemental product, and they're not core to playing the actual game.
I feel like there's a lot of elements to card games that can only exist in the digital realm. Things like, creating a card, like discover effects and stuff like that. Random elements that when you have, like deal 1 random damage to one of a random unit on the board or something like that. Like, that's very hard to actually reconcile with a dice. Like, do you have a D14 if there's 14 things on the board? Like, it's just awkward. I think that counters are necessary in order to keep track of things, but like you mentioned, things just like, I think that we're just spoiled to a degree, and we get, I wouldn't call it laziness on our part, but it's such a crutch when the computer does everything for you, right? Like that's where you can get sloppy in certain cases, but also from a design aspect, it opens so many more avenues when you have a random number generator doing a lot of the work for you in certain cases. But yeah.
Some of the developers at Ravensburger, from what I understand, I did look up at some of their backgrounds. Like, I know one of them in particular was a senior designer at Wizards of the Coast, and I genuinely don't think that a person with that sort of experience and caliber would make that kind of mistake without perfecting the system, really fixing that core issue, that core gameplay loop where it just feels clunky, and like you're basically playing a game. You're playing a game on top of the game, which is just remembering triggers and counters, which is probably the least kid-friendly thing you could possibly do as well. And we've seen Lorcana already strip out a lot of stuff in order to be more friendly and make the game more streamlined. So I really doubt it. There's also one thing I want to call to light on the back of this gift set, which is 2 tracker tokens with themed art. So this is the 2 little pip tokens, and those pips are lore tokens. I mean, it's out by now. I don't know if we're the ones spoiling it, but I've seen it from other people on Twitter. It's lore, and that's what you're stacking up. So 2 lore tokens, and you're tracking that. I think that's actually particularly interesting because it really helps reframe what those symbols might be and what their function is. Because I think at this point we're 100% past them potentially being like some sort of resource that you use to cast your cards. I don't think that's the case, but I'll leave it for the sort of the main topic because I know we get into it, but I just want to point to it because it is on the back of the gift set, and calling them tracker tokens it's pretty important.
With themed art.
Yeah, with
Don't
themed
forget.
art.
With themed art. All right, so the main topic of this episode is going to be the anatomy of a Lorcana card, and we've basically we've dug into some of our theories, but we're really going to get into the crux of it in this one because more cards have kind of been leaked, and I got to chat with Artem from Lorcania, who had a discussion with people like Ryan Miller and part of the design team at Lorcana, and what he told me is quite significant. I know that like you saw when I was describing it to you, I believe your words were, wow, this is some good stuff. And we want to share it. So into the anatomy of a card we go, Brendan, and let's start with the full card art. So here, what you'll see is this is Mickey Mouse, the Brave Little Tailor. And I think that why are we showing you the whole card when we want to dig into the little aspects of it? It's because is the person who created the design of what a Lorcana card looks like. And what's important to note here is that he's somebody who also was integral to the design of and as one of the card frame designers and what the card anatomy looks like. And what was told to was very significant about this is that every aspect of the card has significance, that there isn't something here that is just for show or whatnot. And we're going to dig into a little bit about that. But the reason why we're talking about this, Brendan, is because it says that everything has a place.
I think it's important to get that from the mouth of the creator, because if you look at some of these cards and you look at the cards that were released in that box set back at the Disney Expo, like there are some small incongruencies that actually look like errors. And I think that those have been clarified to not be that. So it gives us a lot of sort of insight onto what these symbols mean and just like how diverse they are, right? Like especially we'll go into the resource symbol here pretty soon, but like I initially thought, I just thought that the resource symbol without like the extra flair on it was a typo, was an issue, was a miscut, or whatever you want to call it. So it is good to get that reassured, because now we can really speculate. Now we can dive deep.
Yeah, that's it. That's the fun part, right? And like as we sort of get closer to release date, to the rules, again, there's a lot of discussion about when Lorcana is going to actually hit us with like an atomic bomb of information, such as like the rules. And they say the spring, and they've been very vague about it. I know that there's there are people in the community out there who are this relentless charge of dropping memes about what Lorcana thinks spring is, and like we're trying to hone it down. But it's a pretty wide window of when we can probably expect things. But it's soon. I mean, it's soon. But let's dig in first, Brendan, with the actual cost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, we'll start off with Mickey Mouse here, which is an 8 cost. I mean, it's one of the higher cost cards we've seen. I think that, I mean, obviously we're looking at the resource here, but if he's looking at Mickey Mouse, I mean, we're trying to evaluate like what constitutes an 8 cost card, right? So you see a 5/5, the stats are actually those are pretty reasonable stats. They're actually on the low end, but Mickey Mouse is the outlier because there are 4 lore symbols or 4 pips on the card. So we call back to this concept in Flesh and Blood where people sort of broke the algorithm and sort of figured out the magical number that things try to add up to. And like that's usually the case in pretty much every single game, is like in order to balance cards, there's a trade-off between cost, power level, and sort of other functional abilities. And with Mickey Mouse, you know, being a 5/5, that's a decent body, but doesn't really compare to other stuff I think we've seen at that sort of resource. So these lore counters are accounting for a lot of what makes Mickey Mouse cost so much.
So the other important thing to note here is, again, that in terms of the design of the card, everything matters. You mentioned that what might have been considered an error or a miscut, as you put it, which I kind of like. There's a frame around the 8, this kind of hexagon where the cost of the card is. There's this framework. It looks like almost... It's a design around the actual cost of the card that has significance. And you might think, well, it has like what kind of significance? Because all the cards have it. Well, they don't. And that's what's important to note here. And let's slam up onto the if you're watching us on YouTube, well, you can see it. If you're not watching us on YouTube, we invite you to check us out at youtube.com/@Podcana podcast. That's what a card looks like that is not that does not have it. So Hades does not have that part right there. If you see it, it does not have the framework around it, the artistic framework. Same thing with a card like Dragonfire, which is an ability or an action card. But ultimately, the first thing that you think of is it's just part of the design. It's just part of what the artwork of the card looks like. But there's more to it, and I think that that's an important factor that we need to make sure people are aware of.
Also important to note that Hades also has Floodborn. Like if you look at the type line there, it's also black, right? It's not yellow. So I don't know if that's going to be it's not the case on pretty much everything that doesn't have the sort of stylistic thing around the resource cost symbol. It also has the black line for the type line with the Floodborn, Villain, King, etc. I'm not sure what this is exactly. Like I said, this was the one specifically. I was like, okay, this image has just been recreated. This is sort of a like an issue, right? It's a typo, but it's not. My best guess would be some sort of devotion, right? So it's like if you're satisfying another criteria, it's like allows you to cast this. I think. I mean, one of my friends suggested that this could be related to like when you're able to play it, whether if you're winning or losing, to stop snowballing. But I doubt that because it leads to so many feels bad, right? Just not being able to play your cards, play your hands. My best guess is like some sort of devotion. So like in the case of like you need to be satisfying some other previous criteria or set of previous criteria in order to cast this for the cost this is played, or probably cast this at all because there's an alternate cost in it. It's like, what are your thoughts? This is honestly, this is the one that has me stumped the most at this point.
As it does for me as well. I mean, because we don't necessarily know how resources are generated yet to a degree as well, and how they're going to be split and such. It might be a matter of, I'm looking at like a lot of my speculation goes into digging into card games that I've already played, and from the popular to the obscure. There's a game called BattleTech that was actually a Richard Garfield game after Magic, where they tried to reconcile cost issues like mana flood, not having the stuff. The game itself, BattleTech, is very similar to Magic. You play like sort of resource things that are kind of like lands. So in the same kind of, there's 5 different ones, and the mechs that you would play would have 2 costs. There would be the costs that would be the cheaper cost, but the more specific cost. So if we're to use this from a Magic perspective, it's like, okay, this card costs 1 green and 1 red. But if you don't have access to all that, it had an alternative cost. Like, let's say you get screwed out of drawing red. It'd be like, okay, you can play 1 red and 1 green, or you could pay 4 of anything else, just to sort of reconcile that. I'm wondering if this is a matter of Mickey Mouse is an 8 and it has to be Ruby related resource to play it, and whereas Hades is like anything. You could pay anything to play it. So I'm very curious. This one really kind of gets me this one, like you, has me very stumped.
So I think that your conclusion makes sense, but it runs off the assumption that the resource system is based off of like a set of colors, or like a land kind of system, right? Where you have like a disparity between the types of resources you're drawing, rather than all sort of being synonymous and the same. And I actually have a theory for the Lorcana resource system. Now, I don't have an image to pull up of it, but if you look at the back of Lorcana card, it's actually pretty atypical for like a normal card back. It just has the symbol. It actually just kind of has the symbol of the resource thing on the back, which is, I understand it's like a normal asset for the game, but it has that, and it's a bit stylized, and there's nothing else. It doesn't say Lorcana. It doesn't have any of that, from what I understand. So I actually think the way you're going to generate resources is you're going to put a single card from your hand face down every single turn to generate your resources. So you're effectively giving up like a piece of like a card advantage to generate a resource, and obviously max 1 per turn, I think. And I think that's my current theory for the resource base of Lorcana. What do you think, Flake?
Well, the other thing that sort of catches my eye here is the fact that like there are a lot of cards that go up into the 8-9 type of atmosphere, where they expect games to go that far. Whereas, so if you're saying you can generate resources by putting a card down, that is a very expensive thing to do, because let's say you start, again, this is all speculation, but let's say you start with a hand of like 7 cards. Let's say under the premise you draw a card every turn. If you're putting down 1 card every turn, there might be a situation where maybe that's not the case. Maybe you don't put down a card every turn. Maybe you can put down as many cards as you want. If you start with 7 and you want to jam a 5 drop down, maybe you put 5 cards down, you jam a 5 drop, you have 1 left. That is the trade-off. It's like, I want to start strong, but I'm not drawing the cards I want. That could also, kind of playing on what your idea is, that is the trade-off of start strong, but have less options.
Yeah, I would be really surprised if they went that route, because it'd be very, very hard to balance. But I think you're also assuming when you say draw 1, because I don't think that's a given or like a constant, right? It could be draw 2. Like there's other ways to offset this sort of resource system and increase card draw, increase players' agency over their decks, and let them see more cards throughout the game. See, because you're right, if you drew a single card every single turn, you would be operating at significant card disadvantage to put resources down. You wouldn't see many cards, and your decisions as a player would be very, very limited. So I think the amount of cards you would draw is potentially up for debate in that sort of system as well. But at the same time, the resource system is not confirmed at all yet.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like, we're all just guessing here. Like, it's still fun to do so, but I think that cost and how cards are paid for is probably the biggest question mark so far, because I think that as we progress through this episode, we're gonna basically sort of have certain things almost on lockdown.
Yeah, I think that a lot of this comes from a lot of the speculation, and when we rule certain things out, does come a bit from faith in the developers, right? So if you put faith in Lorcana, that it and you assume that it's well crafted and they put out a product they want to be successful, and they're using game designers from other successful games, it would also stand to reason that those people wouldn't make the same mistake that Magic just obviously suffers for at this point. The land system in Magic, while it adds a dynamic of gameplay to the game, it's clearly the first draft, right? And it's not the final product. And I would be really surprised to see a AAA game, I'm just calling it AAA TCG game, come out in 2023 and use that system. I highly doubt it.
Well, I mean, look at all the games that have sort of preceded Magic. Magic is kind of like the one of the godfathers, if you will, of TCGs. It's one of the OGs of this game, and everything that's come beyond it. When something works, it usually becomes the foundation for other things to build off of. If you look at Hearthstone has the standard ramping mana system. Every turn you get one more, and then you look at something like Runeterra took that and took the feels bad of not being able to play on a particular turn, or not being able to maximize the usage of your mana on a particular turn, and banking it into a mana bank. So that is already an improvement, where bad turns can also be invested into future turns, which is nice. I have never seen another game after Magic use the same kind of land system successfully, or have dug into it and said, this is what we want to do. So I would be incredibly hard pressed to think that Lorcana would use a land-based mana generating system.
The only games I've seen do it are cheap riff-offs, and I really doubt that Lorcana is that. Let's go ahead and head into the attack and defense here of Mickey Mouse. So, obviously the 5, we say obviously, but we would assume that the 5 on the left here is the attack, and the 5 on the right is defense. So one of my previous theories was that there was no persistent damage, and because these characters actually didn't have health, they had defense. So you either had more attack to conquer the character and beat it in a challenge and banish it, or you didn't. You would simply lose, which is kind of similar to Magic, but also kind of not. But yeah, so we do have attack and defense, and it does look like it's persistent, whether it's over a turn cycle, or the entire game. But that sort of defensive value does have the ability to tick down. I'm assuming attack has the ability to tick up and tick down as well via buffs and things like that.
Yeah, I think this one is as clear-cut as it gets. One of the things being purely from the fact that the defense aspect, it looks like a shield, and from that point onward, you can kind of. The other one is just it's almost like a little starburst, as it were. What I've noticed also is the terminology used in Disney's Lorcana is kind of really avoiding terms like damage, attack, kill or whatever. And I think that it's on brand, especially for what the audience might be for this game as well. But I think that when it comes to strength / attack and defense / health, I think that this is basically as clear cut as it gets.
Well, I'm happy you brought that up because I have a theory that it's all creature based combat, obviously spells and stuff like that, but there's no players, right? There's no sort of omnipresent players that exist outside the board state that you're attacking and reducing some sort of life total from, like you would in Magic the Gathering. I think that it's all actually creature and spell based combat for board state, and it has to do something with the lore tokens as a win condition to sort of win the game. You're not going to be ticking down an opponent's life total. That's sort of my current running theory.
Well, Pokemon actually does it similar, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I think that if we're going to draw parallels, taking away from a life total and attacking a face, so to speak, like you mentioned, like Magic is similar because you as a player exist in the game, but outside of the game arena, as it were. You are the life total. That's what you are the quote unquote wizard or the planeswalker or the spell slinger in this case. In Pokemon, you're attacking or you're creating combat between the two Pokemon. And the win condition is essentially defeating 6 of them or obtaining 6 of the prizes. It's kind of like a health total to that degree, but defeating one Pokemon or dealing X amount of damage to a Pokemon does not increase or decrease your progress towards that win condition. So maybe this has more parallels towards that type of win condition.
Yeah. Well, let's get into this type line, the tribal, and the color. So if we look at Mickey Mouse specifically, it says Dreamborn and Hero. Just to talk about the first one here. So we've seen 3 different kinds. So we've Dreamborn, Floodborn, and then was it Villainborn? Is that the other one?
There's Villain as well. Just flat out Villain, I believe, is
What's
another
the
option.
Other? I'm just going to check on the other. Storyborn, Floodborn, Dreamborn. Okay, that's it. So those are the 3. We haven't seen anything outside those 3. And then you have Hero, Villain, and I mean, we don't have to worry about the kind of the rest of the stuff on the type quite yet. But those 3 as the core sort of macro archetypes of whatever could be on this timeline, I think it's really important. But you also called to the distinction between the colors. So with Mickey Mouse, we do see it's a shade of red. But like we saw in Hades previously, it was black. And apparently that's significant. I have no idea why at this point. I haven't been able to draw a distinction. There's a spell, the Maleficent spell, or I think that's how you say their name. The Dragonfire, I think. That actually doesn't have it. So I don't know what other colors have this black. I don't know if you've seen it. Aurora does. Aurora does.
And this is one of the, again, this goes back to the fact that everything has a significance in here. And if you're drawing parallels, you're looking at the Mickey Mouse, the tribal or the type, the color strip on this for Mickey Mouse, in this case, Brave Little Tailor, is red. However, everything has a purpose as per the designer of the framework of the UI, if you will, of the card. Everything has a purpose. So you're looking at it and you're looking at something like Hades or Stitch or whatever. They both have black palettes on the back, and they're more so, they look like they're painted, like it's an actual paintbrush. It's a little bit more splotchy. It's a little less clean cut. And then you're thinking, well, maybe it's just that color because both Hades and Stitch are yellow. Like that's the color base for the creature. But then you're going back, and when you say, quote, everything has a purpose, look at Robin Hood, which is blue and has a blue color strip, and then look at Aurora, which is also blue but has a black color strip. So there is a distinct difference between the two of them. And that, again, goes back to the fact that this is by design, that there is significance there. But what is that significance? We still don't know. But the important part here is that is an important element to the card game. That is another puzzle piece for all of you sleuths out there who are really trying to, formulate the rules in your mind before, Lorcana actually gives us the goods. Because all of this is speculation, but damn it, there are some really good pieces here.
Yeah, for what it's worth, all of the characters that have the black type line are Floodborn so far. So something to keep in mind. But yeah, I mean, there's not much else to discern outside of this timeline. Like the color is obviously the most important part. We're sort of understanding the macro, kind of the big macro type archetypes between Dreamborn, Floodborn, and Storyborn. And then after that, I think there's going to be some tribal synergy, as we saw in Hades, as a thing. Like your other villains, you get this +1 pip, something like that with the sinister plot. So they are relevant, but I'm really interested about the three distinctions, because those are important, and I haven't found a way to understand why they're important yet. I don't know how the deck building limitations in Lorcana work. Can you only have 2 colors? Can you only have Floodborns? Can you only have Dreamboards? Can you only have 2 of them? Like, do they add some sort of limitation? Is the board state completely open to be played, or are there something like lanes, right? Are there maybe multiple lanes? You can only play the Floodborns in the Flood lane, the Dreamboards in the Dream lane, and et cetera, something like that. So much that could come from this, to be honest.
Yeah, there's a lot to sort of digest here, but again, under the guise or the premise that everything has a place and nothing is just haphazard, that is something that is going to definitely factor into the rules in one way, shape, or another. But I just like what I like about this is the fact that there's distinctions between, you know, it's not just a character, it's a character of a particular class that has a particular affiliation, and that usually alludes to synergistic bonuses based on deck building around that particular archetype. But even from a just fun perspective, Brendan, sometimes it's just a matter of like, I just, you know, like I play Magic. I just want to play Angels, or I just want to play Zombies. And like, it doesn't matter the power level. I think that this is also a good thing when it comes to deck building and enjoyment from the casual perspective as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some sort of role playing. Let's go on to the game text and abilities. I mean, you'll see sort of this on every single card, but looking at Mickey Mouse does have the what I would call a passive ability of evasive, which means only characters with evasive can challenge this character, which is kind of like attacking it. And then of course it has the flavor text. So really not much to dive in on this. We've seen tons of different possibilities for keywords that could go onto that card, which we'll talk about later. But evasive, I think evasive is pretty face value, to be honest. Like, it's pretty straightforward.
We'll talk about evasive when we get into all the keywords that we know so far. What I do want to maybe speculate, there are card games out there that have that the lore of the card actually is important to a degree. Star Wars CCG had cards that actually forced you, or that were in the lore of a Star Wars CCG card, it would give a little bit of history and say, oh, you know, like this character, and like, let's say you're playing Darth Vader, it would say the feared Imperial leader of the Empire, you know, blah blah blah, commanded whatever fleet, yada yada yada. There would be cards out there that would actually say your target leader gets +2 power or something, where the only place that you would find this keyword is in the lore box. So you'd have to actually read the lore to see if the card actually dealt with it. Now, I don't think that that's what's going to happen here, but it is a potential. It's an option, but there are also a bunch of cards that actually have no lore boxes whatsoever. So
yeah, I would be. Yeah, that system does sound pretty clunky too. It's like we have to like we're dissecting the card template for like the smallest text that's in italics.
Oh, yeah.
It's like. Ugh.
Well, the worst part about it was like legitimately when people would actually, and I've seen this, it's like people would say, for instance, like the card Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan never had the term general in the lore box, but people would go and refer to the movies and be like, they refer to him as general in the movies, so this should be a legal play. Like, that becomes very messy in certain cases, and I don't think that's where Lorcana is going, but I have to say it. I mean, we're both very experienced card players. We have to throw out certain theories and potential and possibilities as outlandish. This is a 1 in a million. I don't think it's going to factor in, but it's a possibility.
Well, speaking of 1 in a million, tell me what lore is. Tell me what these pips are.
Oh man, I love these pips. Brendan, this is what I was hoping that you would actually clean up. The more that we kind of dig into pips and stuff like this, and again, I mentioned that when I talked to the Lorcana, when I spoke to the Lorcana Twitter account, the one question that I ventured, the one question that I try to just kind of sneak under the door was, hey, what the hell are these pips? And they said that is probably the one thing, the one secret they are guarding the most, that they didn't want to leak. The one thing that they're hoping is the big reveal. And when it is a big reveal like this, Brendan, my assumption is that it is it is so rule intensive, or it's so intimately linked to the rules of the game, but not just how the game, operates on a microscopic turn to turn basis, but the overarching objective of the game. So I, like you now, am so locked in that this is a win condition oriented part of the board, and it is something that is also tied heavily into the cost of the cards. The more pips, the heavier it's going to cost you as well. And I don't know if that is if the pips are something wherein the more pips you have on a card is beneficial to you, or if it's beneficial to your opponent.
So it's definitely beneficial to you, and this for a few reasons. So we can reasonably discern from other cards. So I'm going to pull up Mulan right now. This is a prime example that pips are positive. So pips are they seem to be definitely not negative. And yeah, I mean, that's just something to consider because it takes out a lot of the other theories that we might have on pips. I also think that pips are win condition. I think it's pretty clear, but I would venture to say that I don't know if they're the only win condition. That's really, really important. When I think about pips as a win condition, I kind of call back to another game called Keyforge, where at sort of the end of the turn, sort of post-combat or something of that nature, you would be able to sort of cash in or reap the pips using the Keyforge term, somehow generate them as sort of a win condition resource. Other than that, I'm not super sure. We know it's definitely a benefit. We're assuming at this point that there is no life total that you're attacking. It's all creature-based combat. And if that's the case, the pips are core to sort of how you win that game, right? It's not going to be, I have 5 characters, you have 4, I win the game. It's probably going to have to, it almost certainly has something to do with these, the lore counters on the heroes specifically.
All right, so I think we discussed this. It might have been last episode. If not, it was in private. But these pips, especially when we're looking at Mulan, has a game text where, whenever this character banishes another character into challenge, your other characters get +1 pips or lore or whatever they are. This might be a situation. I think that we were talking about the idea of at the end of a turn, you could take a card off the board and tuck it or cash it in. Yep. As a sort of, okay, I'm tucking this card away. It's worth X amount of pips. I now have 2 trackers. So let's say you have when Mulan, quote unquote, leads by example, Mulan is out there getting the job done, inspiring the people that are following her. Now, you might be able to say, all right, well, this character went from 1 pip to 2. I'm going to go ahead and cash this character in for 2 pips. I have 2 pips in the bank now. I'm that much closer to my win condition, whether the win condition be something like 10 pips, 20 pips, whatever it is. The reason why I also think that this might be the case is because this also opens up formats. This also opens up a quicker formats, and it also opens up sort of something like, how many pips are we playing? All right, let's play a 10 pip game. Let's play a 20 pip game. Let's do something along those lines. It might also be a situation where you're creating win conditions where maybe there's a card that allows Mulan to banish multiple things, and then you're cashing in your lower strength units for above rate to progress closer to that win condition.
So I think that's what it is at this point. There's another key aspect to this that it's going to sound like it's unrelated, but it is really related. And that's when you attack with creatures, if you can sort of put them together, right? If you can band them together to attack a single thing, or whether each creature combat needs to be single creature on singular creature. Because if singular creature on singular creature, some of these lower cost cards like Olaf has no pips, and it has a 1/3 stat line. 1 so far in what we've seen doesn't kill anything, and the card actually makes no sense because you would drop it and it just does nothing unless they have something that's an X1, which seems to be unlikely, but also it's just maybe they just wouldn't play it. Olaf for me is one of the most important cards that we've seen so far because it sort of breaks the sort of the tenets of what we've seen on every other card. It's a 1/3, 1 cost with no pips. It's just what function does this have in the game? And it's it might just be the most aggressive card you could possibly play because you can't actually use it to progress your win condition. But my assumption based off Olaf as well, which we would have gotten into later, but I'm going to bring it up now, is that creature combat is not singular creature on singular creature. You will be able to sort of put your creatures together to attack a single one. I think that's what it is. If not, someone's got to explain to me the enigma that is freaking Olaf. I think everybody overlooks this guy, but he makes no sense.
Well, besides being quite the character in Frozen. Like the thing about Olaf is, and the stat line of 1-3. A 1-drop 1-3 is like the Hearthstone baseline for a 1-drop these days. It's just what it is. However, 1-3s in those particular types of games are there because they're there to soak damage and to progress into later game, because it's a little bit of it trades efficiently with early game, and it takes work. It buys you time. But if there's no face, quote unquote, to attack, then a 1-3 is, like you mentioned, it's kind of like, what the hell are you doing there? You're not protecting face as it is. You're just there. You're food for bigger creatures and for bigger characters. I would suspect that it might just be a matter of something where, like, yeah, you band together and it's like, all right, well, my 1-3 and my 5-5 together create, a 6-8, and we taking out this, but you on the receiving end, you get to dish out where you want to deal your damage. Do you want to kill the Olaf? Do you want to do this or banish the Olaf or whatnot? That's another element to it.
There's so many questions when it comes to combat, to be honest. Like, I think that based off every single card we've seen so far, the best assumption you can make about turn cycles in combat is that they're done completely siloed of the other player, that they're done completely individually. So there's no blocking, there's no instant speed, nothing like that, right? The player plays his turn, then player 2 plays their turn. And that is the most simplistic way to make the game, right? That is the most sort of kid-friendly and just like easy way. Because like anything outside of that sort of opens priority windows, with blocking being kind of an exception to that rule, where blocking doesn't open priority windows, but it still does make things a bit more complicated. So maybe blocking's a thing, but right now, based off every single card I've seen spoiled by Lorcana, I don't think there actually is instant speed. I think everything is sort of main phase and sorcery speed. But let's go ahead and head into sort of the next thing on Mr. Mickey Mouse, which is just the bottom line. This is the Disney Expo version, but we talked about this on last week's episode with the rarity being shown here in the bottom, as well as the sort of collection number. You won't see this because this is a promo card, but just something to keep an eye out for. Rarity obviously important in games like this, with ascending and descending sort of rarity. If we're at like a game like Magic, it's really funny because if you look at a game like Flesh and Blood, if you look at a card that is at the highest rarity versus a card that's at the lowest rarity, they usually don't differ in terms of value. But if you look at something like Magic Gathering, you could have a 3-drop 3-3 at common, but you could have a 3-drop like 4-4 at the rarest, right? You could just have this effectively like completely pushed stat. And I think that this game is following more that line than the Flesh and Blood line, where everything is sort of stabilized on a singular value.
Yeah, that's typically how it should be. I mean, there are common cards that are just powerhouses. There are uncommons that are just going to get work done, and there are rares and legendary cards that are kind of, I don't want to say garbage, but they just don't make the cut in certain cases. But we'll see how that kind of pans out. This is the least interesting aspect of the anatomy of a card, frankly, in my opinion. But I know there's a lot of people out there who like to play detective, and when new cards start to leak, we would love to have a preview card, by the way, Lorcana, if you're canvassing for those. But a lot of times people, once the first set comes out and they see how the numbering of cards are, it's like, okay, all the heroes and then all the action or spell cards, and then all the equipment comes after that, and then the next hero comes out. So a lot of players will find the numbers within the sets when the next set comes out and say, well, this is numbered at this, which is weird, which suspects that the previous, like they do all the math with it, and then they figure out, okay, how many cards are we getting for this class, for this, whatever. So there is significance there, but for a first set, I think it's the least interesting of all of it.
All right, well, let's talk about some keywords. We already talked about evasive. Let's go ahead and head into shift, which I think is particularly interesting. So I just want to go back to evasive really quickly, and sure. Because evasive is a keyword that only characters with evasive can challenge each other. Now, the problem with this is that if you're looking at Mickey Mouse, I think, which is the only card that has evasive that we know of, the 5/5 baseline stat, if we go to those other cards such as I call it the Chillwind Yeti, it's the green dude, I forgot his name, but that has a 4/5 stat line with basically vanilla stats, and that card costs what, 4 or 5? 5. So there's a 3 cost differential for a 1 stat line gain on this, which I think is almost insignificant. I feel like
for one stat line gain, it's like 0.33 or 0.5 of a cost to go up in a number. I think what we can discern here is how much a pip is worth and how much a keyword like evasive is worth when it comes to the cost of a card.
Yeah, so I mean, if you just did the math, I mean, it almost equals pretty closely to a pip as a single resource. Each pip is an additional resource, and sorry, the pips are another resource, and the evasive is a resource, and yeah, that's how you add up to 8, right?
Oh yeah, so like the 5/5 and like exactly like this is, I think that when it comes down to it, when you're building a card, you have to kind of associate a particular value to a card versus the rarity that it's at as well. And it might just be that evasive is like, well, if you give a vanilla 5/5 is a 5-drop. Every pip is like 0.75 of a resource, and evasive is an additional resource, and that's where we get to where we're at on the actual building of a card. But that's kind of where it's at. That's kind of what I wanted to talk about, at least from evasive. But the fact that if evasive exists, if evasive is a powerful element to the game, if you just can't mess with Mickey because you don't have evasive units, that can become problematic. So it's something to look into.
There's a lot that's interesting about Mickey Mouse being in a power 5/5 with 4 pips. I think that this card, it does look a bit like, it does look like 8 power win the game, and because the stats are so particularly low, and then I don't value evasive as highly, so I think that like the pips are really important, and it kind of draws me closer to the potential pip value to actually win the game, because I feel like you play this card and you should win the game pretty quickly after, because it we played so late, most likely.
Well, you're at 8, right? Like, and I think that part of the game's appeal is going to be to a younger audience as well to play it, and it's adults who play any other card games. Like, part of a lot of the critique that Gwent had like later on in its life was that people were just complaining, oh, my game lasted 15 minutes. Like, this is bull. And it's like, are you like 15 minutes for a game is like, that's not a lot, but people are so used to playing, Pirate Aggro or Face Hunter on Hearthstone where the game lasts 7 minutes, or you basically know if you won or lost within the first 3 turns. I think that if a game goes 8, it should be already determined who's going to win.
Yeah, and that's not even considering Marvel Snap, what that's done to people's attention spans. The card
That's true.
So let's go into Shift, because I think the Shift is really interesting. I think I figured it out. So Shift, it basically says you may play X, play this on top of one of your Y characters. So that doesn't make any sense, right? If you only played Hades as an 8-drop, it's like, yeah, maybe Hades took damage. We have persistent damage throughout the entire turn. Your Hades now is like a 6/1, and you play another Hades for 8. I still think that's like terrible value, and it's just not. There's no way the game actually functions like that, in my opinion. I think Shift would just be kind of a bad ability. So I think that Shift alludes to you playing Hades on top of other Hades that are not 8-cost Hades. So if you look at Hades, it's Hades, King of Olympus. Hades is not the King of Olympus, though. Hades is the King of the Underworld. So this is a high cost. So what if you had Hades at 1-drop, you had Hades at 4-drop, and the 1-drop was like peasant Hades. The 4-drop was like, normal Hades is like reintegrating to society, and then 8 is the King of Olympus. So this gives you a way to, like, you have this sort of tribal theme, and you have this sort of Hades theme in your deck, and you're able to ramp out like the top end Hades because of that. And I think that makes a lot of sense with Shift, and it even makes sense flavor wise. I want to pull up another one here, which is Stitch. And I'm going to pull up another card before that as well. So if we look at Elsa, right? Elsa is like Elsa Snow Queen. It's just very vanilla. It's what you would expect of Elsa, and everything is like that. Like Robin Hood, Archer, Mulan, all that. It all makes sense. But then you have Stitch Rockstar. Well, that doesn't make much sense. Why is Stitch particularly a rock star? It seems like he's been way more narrow than sort of like the vanilla Stitch. And I think it's because of Shift. I think the Shift adds more Stitches into your deck that cost less and allow you to ramp this card out at a faster speed. That's my theory for Shift, Flake. I don't know if you agree with it, but at this point, I'm like 95% on it, I think.
Shift can be ramp is what it could be, without necessarily ramping to the degree where you're also generating a snowball effect on the board. Because, well, a lot of the problems with or the critique that ramp would get in, say, like Hearthstone, like Druid ramp or something like that, is that you're playing above rate for the rest of the game, and you're not, you get to play a 5-drop on turn 4, and then on turn 5 you're playing a 7-drop, but your 5-drop's still there, so you never give your opponent the opportunity to catch up or whatnot while your opponent is generating above rate. That's a great that's a great assessment, and I think that's a pretty decent theory. I also like the fact that you also hit us with a nice little history lesson at the beginning. You're like, he is not the the king of Olympics. That would be Zeus, which it's true, but it's true because like start as like Hades, king of the underworld. Hades, like common peasant, and then like gets up to the surface world, and then moves his way up. That could be something. I would love to rip open any kind of starter deck that Hades is in, or like a Hades themed deck where maybe that's the whole buildup. It's like maybe you have a 1-drop Hades that is bad, and then you could shift up to a 4-drop Hades, like shift 3, play the 4-drop, shift 6, play the 8-drop, like, but you're replacing it the entire time. It doesn't mean that, let's say you draw up and never got to play the earlier versions, that you can't play the other ones. It just means that you're playing them at a ramp speed. And I think that that's a pretty good theory that we can run with.
Yeah. So that's my theory for shift. Challenger, when this character challenges, I think we see this on Hook, right? Challenger +2 on Hook. While challenging, this character gets plus X. This isn't steel, right? So I think this kind of makes sense. So like we have a 1-2, but there's a pip on it. So when I talk about Olaf not making any sense, it's not because he's a 1-3. It's because of 1-3 with no pip. And I genuinely believe that pips and lures are the way to win the game. So you look at Captain Hook, Challenger +2. So when it challenges a character, it effectively becomes a 3-2. I think it makes a lot of sense. It's pretty straightforward. I think it's going to be somewhat on theme for like specific elements. I don't know what you'd call them, but yeah, I mean, steel specifically, I think we'll see more challenge than like other characters or other colors.
Yeah. There's like evasion, evasive is with red, card draw, and stuff like that. The other one that's very important is ward, and ward I think is a very telling aspect here, because ward is another keyword. Opponents can't choose them except to challenge. So this, again, alludes to the fact we've already seen what certain action cards are, like Dragonfire, which is just straight up banish a character. There's going to be a lot of interaction that comes straight from the hand and directly points and clicks at a particular character or an opponent or whatnot. And I think that ward is in itself a keyword. We've seen it in Magic. Ward X is pay X on top. It's like an extra tax just to touch something. But in this case, it's more along the lines of Shroud or Stealth or things along that nature.
Yeah, it basically just means this creature can only be interacted with via creature-based combat, so you can't Dragonfire it, which makes sense. I mean, there's not really much to dive into that, other than I think that this just pushes the narrative that everything's going to be at sorcery speed and there's going to be no instant speed, because I think the ward would have been potentially worded differently. It's just like we don't have a compelling argument to think that anything is instant speed, and I think that we should operate under the idea that it is not before then, because we can see clear examples on other parts of the card design of Lorcana that it's been designed with the intent to simplify it down. And instant speed is the opposite of that, just creating all these priority windows and all the other shenanigans that come with that. So for me, that's kind of what ward pushes a bit farther.
Let's just already dig into the fact that, like, once this game releases, I would guess by Christmas, people are going to be fed up of blue, because look at what blue already does. Blue has ward, blue has freeze effects with Elsa. Blue is the control. Blue is the typical blue. It's the nope, it's the don't touch me, it's the play around the rules. It's usually draw cards, freeze stuff, bounce stuff, deny stuff, and I feel like that is already what people are going to be. I'm already like super excited about blue, because that is absolutely my jam. But blue to me feels like what everybody's going to be complaining about come Christmas.
You're gonna love this, because I think there's actually a small chance that you're wrong, and we can discern that if we look at Robin Hood. This is our first blue card, and you might think that this card is a controlling card, but it's the complete opposite. This card is 100% a tempo card. So if you look at the ability Feed the Poor, when you play this character, if an opponent has more cards in their hand than you, draw a card. That's the most anti-blue thing ever, right? Because it means you're playing on cards, you're playing out your cards, playing out your cards aggressively. You're not maintaining card advantage. This is very likened to something that's more aggressive. And I think that ward being a form of evasion, it doesn't necessarily lend itself towards control specifically, although it does function well in control shells. I think that, we also have Robin Hood gaining evasive. So I think the blues, we've seen both ward and evasive on blue cards, so that is important to notice. But right now, I don't think we've seen a compelling argument yet to suppose that blue is actually the control color. I think that I see it more in potentially steel. I mean, Hook is weird because Hook is going to trade up consistently, which really could fit into any strategy. Honestly, the most controlling card in Lorcana, I thought, prior to this was actually Cruella de Vil. How it was sort of balancing like recursion and stuff like that, but it is kind of a classic green archetype and sort of this graveyard or reanimator or something like that. But yeah, I'm not 100% sold that blue's the normal archetype.
It's drilled into my head.
Yeah.
It's like totally drilled into my head that as soon as you see blue, you're going to be frustrated. You're going to be upset. You're not going to get to play the game that you wanted to. Your deck design means nothing because you're going to get manipulated and sort of distorted into another dimension. I'm always a fan of it. Like people always say like mill is the worst thing in a particular card game. Control, things like that are so boring. It just kills it. But without that, I think that it becomes a lot more boring. If it's just ramp and aggression, you need those kinds of effects. But again, like I said, I've been conditioned to just see blue and think frustration.
Listen, Flake. I'll be your therapist today. You don't have to justify that to anybody. You can just be honest, and fun is sum zero, and you will be having all of it. It is a finite resource in a game.
I love it.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about interactions. I'm going to translate these to other card game terms. So banish is when something goes to the graveyard. We don't have any distinctions between graveyard and exile at this point. Looks like it's all graveyard. Challenge is when you attack something. I'm not sure if that is also when you get attacked, if they call challenge like just all of combat. But it does seem like if you are going to use your character to attack another character, you are challenging them, you are attacking them. So challenge does seem to be attack. And then exert is tap. So yeah, the tap, what you would assume. We're going to talk about, let's just go into it right now. So I've got sort of our ending section here is just going to be nice little tidbits about some of the key factors of this game. So we're going to start off with Stitch here. It's just really interesting because Stitch tells us that everything comes in with haste. So nothing comes in with summoning sickness. So there's kind of two ways you can angle at this. The less convincing way is that summoning sickness is a clunky mechanic that doesn't make sense. So they would obviously try to bring it out if they possibly could, if it made sense. But you could also just look at Adoring Fans on Stitch. Whenever you play a character with cost 2 or less, you may exert it to draw a card. Well, if that card came in with summoning sickness, there would be no cost of doing that. So that should be a downside. To exert it and draw a card, you should be giving up some value. If it wasn't able to be exerted anyway, it would just be a total free roll. So almost certainly everything comes in with haste. Flake, do you agree with that one?
I do, and I think that this needs to be, reiterated, is the fact that I think this is the biggest clue, and I'm so glad that you kind of dug into this and just settled on it because it makes the most amount of sense. The fact that if things did have summoning sickness, you would not have this game text, and it would not be on a 6-drop with a low stat line to mean that this is a fairly powerful related card. And I think that you're spot on. Summoning sickness is not a thing in Lorcana because you can play a card and immediately exert it for benefit. If that were not the case, that game text would be null and void. So I think you hit it spot on. I think that is a very important element, and that is a huge veil pulled back on some of the rules that Lorcana is hiding from us.
All right, so if we head into Mulan here, both Mulan and Hades, they were spoiled with the gift set, but they paint a very clear picture that these lore counters, these pips, are a positive. We were sort of speculating before, like, could they be negative? Are they a cost? Like, they're definitely not at this point because you're getting additional lore counters for winning combat, for doing things that you are effectively like risking your characters or giving up an opportunity cost of them doing something else to gain this. They are obviously a positive and they're progressing you in a positive direction. Hades is the same thing. Hades is sort of a deck building payoff where you are getting additional lore counters for playing other villains. So you're satisfying a criteria, a deck building restraint. So obviously positive at that point. I'm going to pull up Dragonfire here next. So Dragonfire here is the only spell we've seen so far, and it's an action. Once again, reiterating the idea that there is going to be no instant speed. This looks to be sorcery speed, band's chosen character. Dragonfire is particularly interesting for reasons that I can't really put into words, but it's just funny that Dragonfire is a spell in and of itself, but it also exists on Maleficent as well as just like sort of a enter the battlefield effect. Maleficent being a 9-drop 7/5 2-pip and effectively is just a 2-for-1 when it hits the battlefield. Just something to consider. I'm not sure if we're going to see other spells that are on other characters, be individual cards or whatever. Aurora, Shift with the ward. So we talked about Shift, right? We talked about Hades. We talked about Stitch. So this one obviously breaks the mold. Aurora, Dreaming Guardian. That makes sense. But I think this could just be the mid-level one, right? So we talked about like if Hades Queen or Hades King of Olympus is the highest level, the 8-drop, then maybe the 5-drop of Hades or the 4-drop, the mid one is just like Hades, God of the Underworld. And then like the 1-drop is like Hades, like Derelict Peasant or something, So I'm pretty sure Shift is like this progressive progress of this individual character. And once again, I think that Aurora...
Shift is ramp. I'm sold on it right now. It's a way to ramp up the characters. I just feel like this is like a whole other discussion of archetypes and identity of what these colors are going to mean. Like, what is steel? What is ruby? What is amethyst? And things like that. Like, what do they represent? Because card games typically have an association with a particular color or affiliation or class that it plays a certain way. But we've seen Shift on different colors now. Not to say that you can't do that in other card games, but typically there's ramp that is associated with one type, like green in Magic or Druid in Hearthstone. But here we've seen it in blue and we've seen it in yellow, and ultimately I'm really curious, but I'm sold that it is just merely a ramp mechanic, and that's all it is.
So last up is Cruella de Vil, and so again, if we point back to Olaf, we talk about why Olaf doesn't make any sense. It's not because Olaf is a 1/3, it's because Olaf is a 1/3 without a lore counter, and that is what makes no sense. But we have Cruella de Vil, which is also 1/3, 2 cost, but does have the pip. It's just, this is a particularly interesting ability, which is, you'll be sorry, when this character is challenged and banished, you may return chosen character to their player's hand. So it bounces something, right? So my question is, challenged, this tells me the challenge is not only when you attack something, it's also when something attacks you. But like, nobody would ever attack Cruella, right? It doesn't really make a lot of sense unless you're just getting like recurring value by like cashing in that pip every turn or something like that. I'm not sure if that's how it works, but I'm also assuming that this is an effect that works if you attack something else with Cruella and sack it effectively and then bounce their 8-drop back to their hand or something like that. I just think it's interesting. It is quite like tempo oriented, which is unusual, I think, for green from what we're used to. But yeah, something to consider when we look at Cruella here. All right, well, that wraps it up for me, Flake. We definitely will be getting into. I think we might need more information before we start to get into like what the colors mean and color identities. But
yeah,
that is a lot of the stuff we went over in the end was a lot of stuff that I've kind of gone over in my free time and tried to crack. And I think that we've really laid it all out on the table for what we know so far and what we've been thinking for what Lorcana possibly is.
I think that they're fairly responsible and plausible theories that we've thrown out there. I do want to also say what I like about Mulan. Like, there's a Mulan versus Hades deck, right? Like, that's kind of how it goes. And what I like about this, the dichotomy between the two, is that Mulan as the noble leader, when Mulan accomplishes something, everybody else gets better. As the lead by example, like the fearless leader inspiring her troops. Whereas Hades, the more followers Hades has, the more powerful he becomes, the more selfish, and the more like there's a nice little lore aspect to it that is very on point, which I really like. And I thought that was just something that I thought was, it's not rules related. I just think it's on brand for what this is looking to do.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the cards we've seen so far have made sense from a lore from a lore perspective. But anyway, let's go ahead and head into the mailbag, the inkwell, the spilled ink. I don't know. We're still thinking about a name for it. Shoot us a comment. Shoot us a YouTube comment below if you want to tell us what we should name our closing question section here. But it's like you got some questions from Twitter and Discord. Why don't you go ahead and lead us in?
Yeah, so the first question is from Rob, Reckless Star of the Rampage. It's Fab Rob on Twitter, asks, will there be a Marvel or Star Wars IP crossover? This is something that I really, really want. And I think that this is only going to be determined with not just longevity of the game, but like extreme longevity of the game. I think that this is something we will not see for 8 to 10 years if the game is successful. And I don't say they're running out of ideas, but they're looking to put out 4 sets a year. So look, dig through all the Disney movies. You're going to find characters for 5 to 8 years easily. I think that if they ever want to dig into those other gigantic vaults of intellectual property, of source material, it's going to take them 8 to 10 years before they run out of or even run out of steam on the stuff that they currently have. So I don't foresee it happening anytime soon, but crossovers have happened in so many other games. Look at Magic. You can have Optimus Prime fight Rick from The Walking Dead. So it's going to happen.
I think that I doubt it myself, because I think that their other IPs have card games and they have very, very specific identities. Like Magic is definitely an outlier in terms of how it did Sacred Lair and how it started to add some of those cards in. And actually, I think it was executed. It was executed well. I think the Secret Lair is actually a pretty cool product at this point. I think when it comes to Disney, like they're trying to appeal to a very specific audience, and it looks, from everything I've seen so far, it looks like brand congruity is like very, very important to them. So I'd be quite surprised if they ventured off into something like Marvel or Star Wars. Star Wars actually being like kind of a bit edgy, I think, for the audience they're targeting, and Marvel actually probably being more edgy. And of course, we have Marvel Snap, which just came out, and Star Wars has kind of had its tons of its own thing. So I doubt it, but like you said, I mean, who knows in freaking 10 years.
Well, that's it. It's a down the line thing. Next question is from Salty Seacat. Do you think that this is just a Disney skin of MTG?
It's I mean, I think it's a fair critique, right? Especially when you look at card templating, like cost, attack, defense. I think a lot of card games that come out post Magic the Gathering are gonna be sort of criticized by some aspect of them being a skin of Magic the Gathering. I think where card games see a lot of success is when they take the aspects that make Magic good, but then improve upon the aspects that make Magic bad and create their own unique experience doing that. I don't think this is a skin of Magic. I do think that, from what we've seen with the Lorcana, I do think they're trying to go for something unique, uniquely different from Magic. I think they're actually trying to, in essence, in some sort of way, compete with Magic. Maybe not compete with like Grand Prix and World Championships, but compete with the casual player base that dominates dominates the makeup of most of Magic the Gathering's players at this point. I think they're actually going to try to compete with that, and to do that, they're going to need to offer a unique experience.
Yeah, and again, I think, like you mentioned, I think it's a fair question, because everything that we've seen on a card, okay, attack, defense, cost, things like that, game text, abilities like evasive and ward and whatever, like they seem very familiar. And how many games out there? How many different words are there for lifelink, life gain, life steal, things like that? There's so many card games out there that have taken that template and improved upon it, modified it, etc. I think that the basic rules of Magic are such that it's a very appealing way to play, and it's easy to pick up and learn, but it does have the opportunity to have exceptionally deep layers to play it in various different styles to eventually come to, a winning conclusion to the game. I think that this is not a skin of MTG, because any game that does not have a face or a life total automatically excludes itself from being a skin of MTG. It might be a matter of, hey, the stat lines, the anatomy of the card looks very similar, but I think that win condition is the biggest element that you need to look at that would differentiate it from it. And cashing in cards for pips to win the game is so different than everything else out there right now, that, like, at the same time, it's like, the way I was thinking about it, like, what if it's like you cash in a card and it, like, if you have 4 pips, you deal 4 damage to your opponent. But it's the same thing as just putting those points in your bank and doing it the same way. So it's interesting in that regard. So maybe I'm talking myself out of it. I genuinely don't believe that this is a skin of Magic, but I see why you would come to that conclusion based on the anatomy of the card. But without a rule book, man, we'll never know. But I think it looks different enough right now that it draws inspiration from it. But it's not. I don't think it's a skin.
If we wanted to critique Lorcana for having a card templating system closer to or similar to Magic the Gathering, I would say full speed ahead. Because there are so many TCGs that come out nowadays that have the worst card templating with the lowest effort and just absolutely atrocious. Like, it's so bad. And when you look at Lorcana, I don't care if it looks. I wouldn't care if it looked identical to Magic the Gathering because it's clear, it's concise, it's clean, it's good to go. But there are other games that have cropped up, Battle Spirit Saga, Force of Will, where it's just like, who the heck is designing this? It looks like it was designed by I mean, it's just crazy. I'm super happy to have something that is legible, and if it, like, even if it looked exactly like Magic, that's totally good. I think card templating is extremely important, and putting a lot of intention and sort of intelligent design behind that is key to making a game successful. One little funny Easter egg anecdote I'll throw out about the game that Flake and I both play, Flesh and Blood. Flesh and Blood has a funny card templating mishap, which is, you have the color strip at the top of the card, Flake. You know how you have that sort of cost also replicated on the left side, or like the pitch on the left side as well, in like the little circle. Makes no sense. Makes no sense because nobody ever looks at that. Everybody looks at the card strip. It's just like this like redundant piece of information that made its way onto the left side of the card. It's super funny, but yeah, I think the templating is great here.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that too is like the fact that I think that what they designed the color strip to be, I think I remember James White talking about how it's just a quick, like when you're fanning out your cards, you can get a quick look at it without having to count the pips on the left side, where it's like, oh, this is like the shortcut. But the shortcut just became the actual true way to look at it in that regard. Like you can literally take away that real estate at the top left of the card and fill it with something else. You're spot on with that. One more question. This one's from Citizens of Lorcana. When I talked about accounts that tweet memes about a spring release of the rules, this is exactly them. Here's my burning question. What is the resource system going to look like in Lorcana? I think that this is a mystery that we are all trying to unearth.
Yeah, I mean, I put my 2 cents in for it. Like there's a lot of systems out there in other games for like you have these 2 decks where you draw from your resource deck, and you have like the option to draw from your resource deck or your main deck. I hope it's not that. I actually think those systems are clunky. I think that like trying to replicate the Hearthstone system in paper is also kind of clunky. So I don't know, this trade-off where you're actively making a decision between a resource or maybe an additional card to hand, or you're putting cards you don't need down as resources, I think can be pretty eloquent, right? Because like when you draw your 1-drop on turn 5, it's like it's kind of a dead draw, but if that turns into a resource, it's like, okay. And this is also assuming that you're maybe drawing more than 1 card per turn.
This kind of goes back to what I was talking about how card games take good ideas and improve upon them, or take base ideas and improve upon them. Much like how Hearthstone takes the ramping system, Runeterra took it and added that kind of like feels bad bank when things don't go right, and you can sort of bank some of that resource, some of that mana for later use. There might be a situation here, and I don't know when Lorcana started its development, whether it was in 2020 or in 2019, but maybe there's a situation here where it takes away from, let's say, Flesh and Blood, because Flesh and Blood's resource system, I think, is actually quite unique, and I think it's actually quite functional, where it takes bad cards or bad situations and turns them into resources, like you mentioned. What if there's a situation where you open up with 5 cards or 6, and every turn you're drawing a card, but the cost of the card is not necessarily about a resource system that you have. But what if it's like, okay, my 8-drop is I have to put 8 cards at the bottom of my deck. I just have to cycle them to the bottom of my deck. So I'm not milling myself out, but I'm giving myself a significant disadvantage because I need to take out all of these cards out of it. Like maybe it's draw 2 at the beginning so you can get there faster. But if you start with 6 cards and you're saying like, okay, I want to open up with a 4-drop, I'm going to put 4 cards at the bottom of my deck. Now I have a 4-drop. I have a 4-drop, but I have 1 card left in hand. My opponent still has their 6 cards. They drop to 8. Maybe they want to respond with a 7-drop and completely gas themselves out of resources. They have no more hand, but I'm drawing up 2. So do I want to start real hot and heavy and go full throttle at the beginning and then have to sort of build up on that? That kind of is an idea in my mind, but again, there's no real clues that are associated to that. Like there's nothing that really alludes to how resources are generated.
Yeah, I don't think they would do that because it would lead to like some very uninteractive gameplay. Also, if you look at some of the cards, it just doesn't make any sense because like let's say you drop your Mickey Mouse on 8, right? You put 7 cards, 8 cards on the bottom of your deck. I'm just literally doing nothing for a couple turns as well, just drawing cards. But I drop my Maleficent on 9 and I 2-for-1 you lose the game instantly. It would just be like so. It'd be like such a self-contained sort of I think way to like break any form of gameplay. But
that's a skill check. That's a skill check in that regard, right? Like at that point, like you have to. This is where skill kind of implements itself into the game, where you're saying, "Do I take this risk?" Because if my opponent is playing a deck with that might run Maleficent or or a Dragonfire or whatever, like you have to assess that. Again, we don't know how many cards you're drawing, how many you start with. But if that was the resource system, then and you want to play a card as strong as Mickey Mouse in that regard, with evasive, with 4 pips and stuff like that, maybe that's a risk that you have to take.
Yeah, one of the main things that makes me think it's the card face down specifically is the back of the card. I think the back of the card is pretty atypical. The fact that it has like no mention of Lorcana, and from what I've seen, like the printed versions I've seen, no mention of Lorcana. It's just like the symbol. It looks exactly like the resource symbol. It looks like it's perfectly set up to sort of plug and play. You don't have to sleeve the deck, and it can function as a resource on the board. One thing I do want to mention is that if you look at the starter decks, there are 60 cards. 60 cards with no lands is a lot of freaking cards in the deck. Yeah. It's like a lot. It's a lot of cards because like a Magic deck also 60 cards, but it's not comprised of all, like a lot of those are lands, and that's a huge part of it. So just something to consider.
Well, that's all we've got, I guess, from the mailbag. Thank you so much for the questions. If you have questions for Brendan or myself, you can go ahead and tweet them at Podcana on Twitter. You can drop them here in the YouTube video. Catch us on Discord or out in the wild. Plenty of ways to get in touch with us, but we do appreciate your questions. Trust me, we are having a lot of fun, Brendan. I think just kind of doing the detective stuff here and piecing out the clues.
I would love, like, how sometimes card spoiler seasons, they're like a week or they're like 2 weeks. What's a better system for that? And I don't know why nobody else does it. Space out the cards proportionately over the longest period of time possible before the release. Like, let's say there's 200 cards left in a set, give us a card every 3 days or something like that. Or give us a card every day, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? Because like August is when everybody kind of gets a Gen Con, is when people are going to finally get their first licks at the game. The rules are going to be released spring, so Lorcana, whatever you think spring is, I hope it's whatever March 21st would be the best thing for us. I think it's when spring kicks off, but it would be nice. Like once we get the rule book, then the cards that we're revealing become more clear in terms of how we assess their power. We won't have much to really relate them to. We don't have a previous set to sort of compare them to. But I like you, if I was Lord Disney Lorcana, and if you're listening, Disney Lorcana, reach out. If part of the fun in the discussion, and it's just a great marketing aspect as well, is just to be like, all right, we're not going to tell you the rules, but we're going to give you a card with a new keyword in it, or we're going to give you a card that kind of alludes to a different type of interaction that might clarify how things go. For instance, like you're the way that you figured out Stitch and how summoning sickness is not a thing. I think that's a very important part of it, is that one card doesn't tell you that there's no summoning sickness, but the way that you interpret it makes you think that, hey, it would be silly if summoning sickness existed because this card would, or like, how kind of things work in that regard.
Yeah, I don't even think they need to give us like unique cards or like things that like give us things like just spoil cards at like irregular intervals, like leading up to the actual release. Like I feel like it's such a miss when I look at a game like Flesh and Blood that does an entire spoiler season in a week, right? Because people become overwhelmed, they become apathetic, and they just look at it at the end of the week anyway. And it's like with Lorcana, like we're hanging on like the edge right now for every card that comes out. Like Aurora came out, we're like, oh my god, right? And it's just like I would just love to get that card drip like all the way up into release, just so they can keep that hype train rolling.
Yeah, every 12 hours, I think, is the right way to do it. No, I'm not being like silly here. I'm literally saying like you'll get people on both sides of the planet, and you'll have the people who wake up at like 9, like at 9 a.m. they get a card drop. At 9 p.m. they get a card drop. The next day it's the same thing. You wake up and you have something to look forward to at the end of the day. I think that's perfectly fair. If there's 200 cards that are left to be spoiled, and we're going to see the cards in August. I mean,
it's one a day, baby, almost.
Yeah, we're almost at one a day. And like, if they want to release the rule book first in a couple of months, like if they start feeding us, like spoon feeding us cards in like mid to late April, like 2 a day until the release, I think is like the right schedule for that.
All right. Well, that's gonna be it for episode 2 of Podcana. Here we did talk about, we talked about the anatomy of the card, we talked about the keywords, the interactions, and broke down little tidbits such as no summoning sickness existing in the game and all these other little things, pips being positive, etc., on our deep dive today. So thank you all for listening. We've had a great time. Lorcana, please give us more stuff to to talk about. We would love to do it, but until next time, we'll see you in the next episode.